particular slide, but basically the brown part there is the crust that cracked, and you got this supercritical water from 60 miles deep jetting out at this tremendous pressure. It says it was at about 3,200 psi and about 700 degrees was the supercritical water that comes out. Right, and it gushed into the atmosphere, beginning where it broke first at the highest pressure, and this went furthest into the atmosphere. So he had theorized. You might remember for a previous lesson. This is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, this big crack that happened, and it sucked in the Pacific Ocean as well. But it goes all the way down to the South Pole, and over here to the Indian Ocean and back up. Right, he theorizes that this crack began somewhere up here around the Bering Strait in the north. And in those days, the Earth stood up straight, right? Like this, right? But if you think about it, if it started up here, that's where the pressure was greatest. So now this crack starts, and the water starts spewing out, and the pressure starts being reduced. But at this point, it's at its highest point, and it's throwing the water out the furthest. And remember in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the floor of what is today the ocean buckled upwards, and these big plates slid away, right? And when they kind of banged into one another or stopped, in the case of the Pacific side, they stopped because this 60-mile deep piece of granite started grinding into the bottom of what was the subterranean chamber. It stopped, created the Rocky Mountain chain. But over here in Europe, it basically banged together and caused the Himalayan chain, right? So we're going to talk about that here in a second. But because that water was coming so hard, so fast at that point, well, not done here yet. It shot out here so high in the atmosphere, it basically made it out beyond the Earth's atmosphere into outer space, some of it, right? But it got far enough out here that it froze, and it froze so hard, it comes back to Earth as ice. And if you can think about it a second, this crack is going all the way around the Earth. The water is spewing out like this, and the Earth is still turning under it, right? So this ice now comes back down on what is today the North Pole, the Arctic region. And when these continents banged into one another and the Himalayas shot up, the Pacific Ocean gets sucked in, right? All the mass from within the Earth got changed, got moved. And so the balance of the Earth spinning on its axis was disturbed because the mass distribution was different, and it caused the Earth to roll. He calls it the big roll, right, which we'll talk about here in a second. But during that roll, this ice is falling back down on the northern portions, okay, well, actually in the southern portions as well. We'll get to that in a second. So this, where it says extreme rain is coming down, some of it was rain, it didn't go as high, but it went high enough, turned into ice, and it comes back down. It says some of the muddy water from the fountains of the great deep jetted above the atmosphere where it froze to extremely cold hail. Within hours, many animals, including mammoths, which could not have lived in today's Arctic climates or Arctic latitudes, were buried alive and quickly frozen as some of this muddy hail fell back to Earth in a gigantic hailstorm. We're going to talk about today is why do we find so many fossils, and most interestingly, my opinion, frozen animals that were flash frozen above the Arctic Circle. They clearly lived in temperate zones or even tropical zones, right? We're going to show you some evidence here today of that. So the sudden formation of major mountains altered the spinning Earth's balance, causing the Earth to slowly roll somewhere between 34 and 57 degrees. So it rolled over a long way. Today, this axis, or the tilt of the Earth, is about 23.4 degrees from vertical. But during this roll, it rolled over much further. And it's been oscillating, frankly, ever since. It's been trying to recover, just like I played with the top before. Spin the top, and it stays very steady as long as it's spinning rapidly. When we start slowing down, whatever imperfections there are in the mass distribution of the thing cause it to start wobbling. Well, the Earth didn't slow down. In fact, it sped up because it reduced in diameter slightly, as I told you earlier. But the mass distribution causes it to roll. So it starts doing this, right? Whereas today, now some 4,500 years later, it's gotten pretty steady, right? And this precession, they call it, is now reduced to about 6 degrees. over, I don't know, 10 or 15 years or something, right? It still wobbles a little bit. But for the most part, the big roll in the beginning was pretty severe. It says the North Pole, then in what is now Central Asia. So I keep picking this thing up. But at the time, when it was up like this, the North Pole was over here somewhere, right? And now it's tilted over. It says the North Pole, then in what is now Central Asia, began to slow shift to its present position. That's why coal, dinosaur fossils, and other temperate fossils found near today's South Pole, and fossils show that Hadrosaurus lived year-round in today's Arctic. So we had animals that were living in these temperate zones here, right? That their fossils are now showing up here today, and in the South Pole, the ones that were living down in this region, down around the South Pole. So it says many researchers have also discovered vast dinosaur and mammoth remains inside the Arctic Circle. All were at temperate latitudes before and during the flood, but rolled to their present latitudes after the flood. So some pretty curious stuff they're finding, and I'm particularly fascinated by the frozen critters, actually animals frozen solid. And this is kind of the way he depicts it in a picture, in a diagram. It says the North Pole is the point where the spin axis penetrates the northern hemisphere. It shifted, and the rolling cycle continued at a diminishing rate until after a few centuries. It's about 34 to 57 degrees was the magnitude of the roll. And all the Earth's mass became balanced again, because all that, remember that stuff in the center of the Earth was kind of moving around. And it balanced out at about 23.4 degrees is what we see today, right? Just for reference, the latitude of Washington, D.C. today is about 38.9 degrees. When the Earth was vertical, we would have been about 15.5 degrees north of the equator, which would have put us roughly about where Honduras is today, or Sudan, somewhere in that general region, fairly close to the equator. It says the direction and magnitude of the roll are also shown by fossils found inside the Arctic Circle of animals and plants that today live at specific temperate latitudes. Remains of a camel, horse, bear, beaver, badger, shrew, wolverine, rabbit, and considerable temperate vegetation are found on Canada's Ellesmere Island inside the Arctic Circle. So this kind of shows us where Ellesmere Island is, up north of Greenland, right? So today, these animals and plants require temperatures about 27 degrees warmer in the winter and 18 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the summer to live. Also found are remains of large lizards, constrictor snakes, tortoises, alligators, tapirs, and flying lemurs, now only found in Southeast Asia. Isotopic studies of cellulose in redwood trees on Axel Heiberg Island, which is just west of Ellesmere Island, show that they grew in a climate similar to that of today's coastal forests in Oregon, 35 degrees south in latitude. So redwood is a fairly unique wood or tree. Today grows in Northern California and Oregon, mostly, some in southern Washington. But they're finding remains of redwood trees up above the Arctic Circle, right? So I'm just going to be transparent here. We're challenging millions of years in evolution here, right? Because the evidence just doesn't support it, right? I'm going to do a whole lesson on this, hopefully, Lord willing, in the future. But for every major civilization of the world in recorded history, there has been a historical account of a global flood, okay? And this is one that's kind of interesting. It said, an ancient historical record tells of a catastrophic flood and an apparent earth roll. Famous linguist Charles Berlitz reports that early Jesuit missionaries in China located a 4,320 volume work compiled by imperial edict and contained all knowledge. So the pursuit of big data is not new, right? Man's been trying to do that forever. He was trying to capture all data, the king was. But the document says this, says the earth was shaken to its foundations, the sky sank lower towards the north, the sun, moon, and stars changed their motions, the earth fell to pieces, and the waters in its bosom rushed upward with violence and overflowed the earth. This is a Chinese historical document, This is not a Christian document, okay? It says, man had rebelled against the high gods, and the system of the universe was in disorder. This is one among many. I'll do a lesson on it, but I think there are something like 80 different accounts of worldwide floods, global floods, independent of the Bible. Okay, and this is a kind of a diagram or a picture that shows that Chinese account. And it's kind of interesting. Their account is one man saved humankind in a boat, and there were 8 people. Okay? So, science would tell you that the Earth has experienced multiple ice ages, right? And I'm going to submit to you we've seen one. And in fact, you could argue we're still living in it to a certain extent, right? But I'll get to that here in a second. It says an ice age implies extreme snowfall, which in turn requires cold temperatures and heavy precipitation. Heavy precipitation can only occur if oceans are warm enough to produce heavy evaporation. You've got to get the water vapor in the air before you can get precipitation, right? And how could warm oceans exist with cold atmospheric temperatures? Well, if you remember, according to his theory, and I stress it's a theory, but we're just gathering evidence, right? According to his theory, this supercritical water that gushed out from this chamber was 700 plus degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as the pressure is reduced, the temperature drops, right? But what happens is all that water runs out, about half of it remains in the ocean today. Some of it came back as ice, right, that is still in the polar caps. But it was pretty warm, right? So another problem with the current theory is stopping an ice age once it begins. Whatever caused it to start has got to stop, right? Or beginning a new ice age after one ends. As glaciers expand, they reflect more of the sun's radiation away from the Earth and lower temperatures, causing glaciers to grow even more. Eventually, the entire globe should freeze permanently. Conversely, if glaciers shrink, as they have in recent decades, the Earth should reflect less heat into space and warm up, eventually melting all glaciers, right? So we got this hullabaloo going on. I might do a lesson on this one too, about climate change, global warming, so on and so forth, right? About how, man is responsible for all of it. There's been a whole bunch of cycles for global warming over the centuries. It had nothing to do with man's contribution. Now, I would be the very first to admit that man has been a very rotten steward of the environment God has given him to take care of. No question about that. He's done a very poor job. But this business of man being singularly responsible for the climate changes we see today, I think is not true either. But he says this, Dr. Brown saying, is don't be misled by mainstream science that claims that hundreds of thousands of layers of glacial ice can be counted, because they do these borings down in ice, down thousands of feet, get a core sample, and they claim that they can count annual layers of snowfall in there, right? And he's saying, can't be done. Frankly, we can only observe less than 2,000 layers, and that's even with magnification. And the reason is after it gets so deep, the weight alone compresses it so much you can't see the layers anymore. But what they've tried to do is go and measure certain things they can find in there, like dust content or certain isotopes like oxygen-18 and things like that, and come up with certain places where they find variations in those kinds of properties. And then they go back, this is kind of interesting, they go back and take a model that has hundreds of thousands of cycles in it and try to fit the data to it, right? Why hundreds of thousands of cycles? Because they've already assumed the Earth is millions of years old. So they try to take the data and make it fit their model rather than taking the data and having it either prove or disprove their model, right? And that's not the scientific method. In fact, remember early on we talked about the perception, meaning where you start with, has a very, very large impact on the conclusion you're going to come to, right? Here's an example. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this illustration before or not, but this is a bunch of blind men trying to examine and determine what an elephant is, okay? So one guy feels his side and says, it's a wall. Another one feels his leg and says, well, it's a tree. Another one feels his tail. Oh, it's a rope. His ear is a fan. His trunk is a snake. His tusk is a spear, right? Each one of them is drawing a conclusion based upon a very limited amount of data. They cannot see the big picture, right? They refuse to look at the big picture, actually. right? And they're going to swear to you that that elephant is a spear, because that's all they saw, right? But if you start from the notion that the world is millions of years old, right, and all the data has to support that, then you're going to try to twist the data some way to make it fit your preconceived notion. And that's what they've done in so-called mainstream science today. Here's another example. The woolly mammoth has kind of become the poster child for ice-preserved creatures. And we're going to see today there are numerous frozen mammoths and other animals of its kind in the Arctic, right? So some of the most well-preserved specimens have been found in Siberia with their hair, skin, and even internal organs largely intact. Scientists have been able to extract DNA, providing a wealth of information on how these giants lived and what contributed to their eventual extinction. I'm going to submit to you, I think we know what their extinction was, what caused their extinction, right? It was a thing we called the flood. But says that a common misconception that mammoths lived in areas of extreme cold comes primarily from popular drawings of mammoths living comfortably in snowy Arctic regions, like this one, okay? The artists, in turn, were influenced by earlier opinions based upon the mammoth's hairy coat, its thick skin, and 3.5-inch layer of fat under the skin. However, animals with these characteristics do not necessarily live in cold regions. The fact that it is a hairy animal does not mean it has to live in the Arctic, right? We have many examples around the world today of animals that have thick coats of hair or wool, right, that do not live in Arctic regions. In fact, could not survive in Arctic regions, right? So that's kind of the way some of these misconceptions get started. Somebody draws a picture based upon their assumptions, right? And it becomes viral. It's just like the idea of the caveman walking around with no clothes, with a club dragging his wife around by her hair, right? Some artists came up with that back in the 1800s or something like that to describe how primitive man lived. And it became published, and the whole world assumed that's what ancient man looked like, right? Not true, never was true. Says, the mammoth's hairy coat no more implies an Arctic adaptation than a woolly coat for a sheep. Mammoths lacked erector muscles that fluff up the hair. So animals that live in the Arctic region have muscles at the bottom of the hair follicles that cause them to stand up, right, that captures the air and keeps them warm. The mammoth did not have such a thing because we could actually examine their hair. So it was not a sign of adaptation to the north. So we have found numerous completely frozen animals in the Arctic ice and in the tundra we call permafrost, right? This is one, the American bison. We found completely frozen intact. So North America has revealed some stunningly preserved bison from the ice. These Pleistocene herbivores presumably lived 2.5 million years to 12,000 years ago. And we've already talked about the fallacies with the way they date those things, right? But they provide a glimpse into how they lived. So we've got actual bison, buffalo. They were frozen completely intact in the Arctic, right, above the Arctic Circle. These are cave lion cubs that were found frozen above the Arctic Circle as well. But the one that kind of captures most folks' attention are the mammoths. There are many, many mammoths. In fact, Dr. Brown in his book, I think, lists about 60 or 80 examples of frozen mammoths and woolly rhinoceros that were found frozen completely intact above the Arctic Circle. This is Dima, found in 1977. It's the first complete baby mammoth was found. It's a 6 to 12-month-old male named Dima. His well-preserved body is encased with within a lens of ice, meaning it was clear ice. You could see him in the ice, right? He was 6 feet below the surface of a gentle mountainous slope. Portions of the ice were clear and others quite brownish and yellow with mineral and organic particles. Where did that come from? All this water that came out had all this mineral in it, right, which we see show up in a lot of different places. Silt, clay, and small particles of gravel were found throughout its digestive and respiratory tracts. These details are important clues in understanding frozen mammoths. How did he die? He drowned in dirty water, okay? He had mud, gravel in his digestive tract and his respiratory tract. This is Lyuba. She's a baby woolly mammoth who was discovered in Siberia, represents one of the most complete specimens of its kind. It's an infant mammoth and provided invaluable data on early mammoth development and the diverse challenges they face from early age. It was preserved in pristine condition, and the specimen shows skin, hair, and even evidence of the last meals that were consumed. They actually opened up some of these things after they found them and examined the stomach contents, and it was fresh, just like you got it from the grocery store, because it was flash frozen. We're going to talk about that here in a second. It says Yucca. It was a juvenile mammoth, also found in Siberia. Stands out not just for its preservation, but for the clues it offers about ancient predator relationships. This one had some injuries, like an animal had attacked it or something like that, right? So it gives a viewpoint about how they lived, what kinds of things were trying to kill them or eat them, stuff like that, right? This is one that's it's a model on display in a museum in South Dakota that was found in the permafrost. So you hear a lot of discussion, I'm just going to call it fear-mongering perhaps, about the fact that permafrost is melting in certain places. Permafrost is basically dirt that has been permanently frozen for long, long periods of time. And because of the so-called global warming or climate change, some of it is in fact thawing out. And that's a fact. That's actually happening. Okay, and so when that happens, sometimes stuff like this gets found. It kind of shows up where you weren't expecting it before, particularly with glacial kinds of things, with ice. When the water melts, these things become exposed. This is perhaps the most famous one there is. The most famous of all mammoths, the frozen Berezovka mammoth. He's displayed in the Zoological Museum of St. Petersburg, Russia, in the struggling position in which he was found near Siberia's Berezovka River, just inside the Arctic Circle. His trunk and much of his head, reconstructed in this display, had been eaten by predators before scientists arrived in 1901. So there are many examples where, particularly in Siberia, northern Alaska, northern Canada, and so on and so forth, some of the locals find critters like this, they cut them up and eat them. And that's how fresh the meat is. It is flash frozen, right? So after a month of excavation, 10 pony-drawn sleds hauled most of his cut-up carcass more than 2,000 miles south to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. From there, he was taken to St. Petersburg Zoological Museum, and it's today's leading institution for studying frozen mammoths. You notice there's a handle at the bottom of the picture of a shovel, right? Bottom center of the picture. And that shows the scale of this critter. This is a full-grown, mature adult mammoth, right? And it too was flash frozen. I'd like to think about that just a second. Frozen to the point where the stomach contents were still fresh, okay? They were able to, when they thawed him out, it had liquid blood, right? He was upright, although his back was extremely humped, and his straightened hind legs were rotated forward at the hips to almost a horizontal position. This is another angle of the same thing, obviously, in the museum. Got a reflection from another window there, it looks like, so hope that's not too distracting. It says, this strange contorted position was further exaggerated by his raised and spread front legs. Several ribs, a shoulder blade, and pelvis were broken. Amazingly, the long bone in his right foreleg was crushed into about a dozen pieces without noticeably damaging surrounding tissue. This means the leg wasn't broken, it was crushed from compression, and the bone broke in about 12 places, okay? So the bone didn't come sticking out through the flesh or anything like that. It says that there had been considerable bleeding between the muscles and the fatty and connective tissues. His shaggy wire-like hair, some of it 20 inches long, was largely intact. This position shows this animal died from being crushed vertically under ice. He died from suffocation, right? So the broken bones, I mean, how do you break that many bones in an elephant, right? I'm going to submit that's quite a lot of weight, and it was applied quickly, and it crushed him. It broke ribs, pelvis, legs, right? And he's struggling to get up. It's the way he was found in basically thawed permafrost. Here's another example. It's called the steppe bison. It was a remarkable find in Yukon, Canada. The blue bay bison was named for the bluish sheen in his skin due to mineralization. Some of that other mineral we talked about was in the water, got in his skin, and he froze. Specimen had intact muscles and features, offering a tantalizing look at the species' anatomy and health at the time was frozen. But I'd like you to take note of the position again. If anybody raised cattle, they don't die in that position, right? They're usually on their side when they die. This animal died quickly, suddenly, and was squashed from above, right? And just laid down. Here's an interesting one as well. The Benkendorf mammoth. In May of 1846, a surveyor named Benkendorf and his party camped along Siberia's Indigirka, I'm not very good with Russian, river. The spring thaw and unusually heavy rains caused the swollen river to erode a new channel. Benkendorf noticed a large object bobbing slowly in the water. As the black, horrible, giant-like mass, this is his quote, what he wrote down, as the black, horrible, giant-like mass was thrust out of the water, they beheld a colossal elephant's head, armed with mighty tusks, and its long trunk moving in an unearthly manner, as though seeking something lost therein. They tried to pull the mammoth to shore with ropes and chains, but soon realized its hind legs were frozen in the river bottom in a standing position. Later, however, 24 hours later, the river bottom thawed and eroded, freeing the mammoth. A team of 50 men and their horses pulled the mammoth onto dry land 12 feet from the shore. The 13-foot tall, 15-foot long beast was fat and perfectly preserved. Its widely opened eyes gave the animal an appearance of life, as though it might move in a moment and destroy them with a roar, he said, right? They removed the tusks. It's a very valuable thing, oh, by the way, we'll get to in a second. There is still a market for mammoth tusks today. It says they removed the tusks and opened its full stomach containing young shoots of the fir and pine and a quantity of young fir cones, also in a chewed state. Hours later, and without warning, the riverbank collapsed because the river had slowly undercut the bank, and the mammoth was carried off towards the Arctic Ocean, never to be seen again. Okay. But this happened all over Siberia. I'll show you here in a second. It's a very common event. During the flood, when the water's rising, right, and the ice is falling, he says larger, stronger animals such as mammoths and rhinoceroses best withstood the driving rain and cold wind as they sought safety. Mammoths and rhinoceroses were standing as the colder hail began piling up. Hail with temperatures of about minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So he's calculated how high some of this water would go into the atmosphere and what the temperature might be up there, right? If you've studied astronomy or astrology or anything like that, you know that out in space, the temperature approaches absolute zero, which is minus 273 degrees. He says, this super cold ice pressing against their bodies rapidly froze even their internal organs. So the ice piled up so quickly, it basically froze them in place and flash froze the entire body through and through. Quick enough, it preserved even the contents of the stomach, right? Just like you'd find it in the grocery store if you were buying meat in the grocery store. Here's another interesting little piece. Like I say, there's quite a market even today for mammoth ivory because it's all over the place up there, right? And they found that over wide geographical areas, mammoth tusks are embedded on one side with millimeter-sized particles rich in iron and nickel. This is all that gravel and stuff that gets shot out as the water is spewing forth through this crack, right? Goes way up in the atmosphere and comes back down. Hits them from above and knocks holes in their tusks, right? But science can't accept that just yet. It says, this has led some to wonder if meteorites exploding high in the atmosphere punctured those tusks. The British Broadcasting Corporation stated, startling evidence has been found which shows mammoths and other great beasts from the last ice age were blasted with material that came from space. But is that the whole story? Well, it did come from space, but it didn't originate there. It originated here, went up there, and fell back down, right, according to Dr. Brown. And it actually punched holes in the tusks. But this is just a map showing, these are the cases that he actually outlines in his book, if you're interested in looking at some of that stuff. He's got a bunch of this stuff recorded, but this is where some 60 or 80 mammoths and rhinoceros have been found frozen completely intact above the Arctic Circle, right? They're very, very common. But he says if we look for the bones and ivory of mammoths and not just preserved flesh, not the whole thing, just looking for remnants, he says the number of discoveries becomes enormous, especially in Siberia and Alaska. Nikolai Vereshchagin, I guess that's how you say his name, the chairman of the Russian Academy of Sciences Committee for the Study of Mammoths, estimated that more than 500,000 tons of mammoth tusks were buried along a 600-mile stretch of the Arctic coast. Because a typical tusk weighs 100 pounds, this implies that about 5 million mammoths lived in this small region. Even if this estimate is high or represents thousands of years of accumulation, we can see that large herds of mammoths must have thrived along what is now the Arctic coast. Mammoth bones and ivory are also found in Europe, North and Central Asia, North America, and as far south as Mexico City. And this guy is actually a tusk hunter. It's quite a trade in that part of the world today. There are certain areas that are known to have high concentrations of these tusks, and they go gather them up and sell them. The biggest market being in China, where they still like to do ivory carving and stuff like that. You might know that ivory from regular elephants today, it's illegal to import that stuff now because they're considered to be endangered or becoming endangered, so they're trying to save the elephants. But these guys are already gone. So they go around and try to find these tusks. And there's enough of them out there, there's actually businesses that do this, right? They go gather up these mammoth tusks and sell them. It says dense concentrations of mammoth bones, tusks, and teeth are also found in remote Arctic islands. Obviously, today's water barriers were not always there. How did those guys get out there on these little bitty islands in the Arctic? Well, the water levels are different today than they were back then, right? It says, many have described these mammoth remains as the main substance of the islands. They're so thick, right? It says, what could account for any concentration of bones and ivory on barren islands well inside the Arctic Circle? Also, more than 200 mammoth molars were dredged up along with oysters from the Dogger Bank in the North Sea. Am I familiar with the Dogger Bank? There's been a lot of discussion about that. Some people have called it another continent. Some people said that's where Atlantis is. But basically, it's well acknowledged that there's this area between the UK and Norway, essentially Denmark, that is a little bit shallower than the rest of the ocean floor. And clearly it was inhabited by other animals at some time. So it sunk at some point. And so it's caused a whole lot of scientific investigation as well. But they found all kinds of mammoth remains on the Dogger Bank. So, says the northern portions of Europe, Asia, and North America contain bones of many other animals along with those of mammoths. A partial listing includes tiger, antelope, camel, horse, reindeer, giant beaver, fox, giant bison, giant ox, musk sheep, musk ox, donkey, badger, ibex, woolly rhinoceros, lynx, leopard, wolverine, Arctic hare, lion, elk, giant wolf, ground squirrel, hyena, bear, and many types of birds. Now, if you're going to find all those bones in one place, how does that work? It says carnivores are sometimes buried with herbivores. Were their deaths related? Rarely are animal bones preserved. We talked about last week, the whole business of fossilization is a rare event nowadays. I mean, it can be done, but certainly not on a large scale like we see here. In order to have a fossilization, it's got to be buried and buried rapidly and buried completely so no oxygen gets to it. And there's got to be certain minerals in the stuff it's buried with that gets into the bones, right? It says, rarely are animal bones preserved. Preservation of so many different types of animal bones suggests a common explanation. You got all these different types of animals, and they kind of all decided to go to the same place and lay down and die. Why would they do that? And mainstream science would tell you it takes millions of years. So they all kind of laid down on top of one another over millions of years and died. No. Basically, and Dr. Brown's theory, I have to keep reminding you of that, it's his theory, but I tend to think he's got some pretty good evidence to support it, is that basically when the flood happened, all these critters are running, they're dying. God said he was going to destroy all flesh, right? And he did it. But they're running around trying to find high ground or whatever, and they die en masse. And this flood water is sloshing back and forth all over the world. Remember, the world's spinning, but it's doing this, right? So it's almost like a washing machine, right? This water is about a mile deep all over the earth. And it's washing all kinds of things around. It's got dead animals. It's got trees and plants, all kinds of vegetation that's been ripped up. And you got these big piles of it that kind of wind up in one location and get buried, right? So some of it gets buried in the sedimentary rock we talked about before. Some of it gets buried in this stuff we call muck, which is another name basically for permafrost in a lot of parts of the world. But it says muck is a major geological mystery. It covers 1/7 of the Earth's land surface. Think about that one a second. And it's all surrounding the Arctic Ocean. Muck occupies treeless, generally flat terrain with no surrounding mountains from which the muck could have eroded. Russian geologists have drilled through 4,000 feet of this muck without finding solid rock. That's 0.8 of a mile. Where does so much eroded material come from, and what eroded it? So this sediment, I'm going to call it a type of sediment, right, winds up being distributed over this large area, 1/7 of the Earth's landmass, right, and what turns out to be sort of this big plain. You can see kind of a picture there. It's a flat area. And this stuff is about a mile deep, just under a mile deep. Oil prospectors drilling through Alaskan muck had brought up an 18-inch long chunk of tree from almost 1,000 feet below the surface. It wasn't petrified, it was frozen. Okay, so this is actually a living tree that got flash frozen in place. The nearest forests are hundreds of miles away. So this guy Williams had made other discoveries in Africa as well. He says, though the ground is frozen for 1,900 feet down from the surface at Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, everywhere the oil companies drilled around this area, they discovered an ancient tropical forest. It was in a frozen state, not petrified. It is between 1,100 and 1,700 feet down. There are palm trees, pine trees, and tropical foliage in great profusion. In fact, they found them lapped all over each other, just as though they had fallen in that position. So again, you got this huge pile of vegetation that wound up getting deposited there and then covered up with 1,700 feet of muck, which froze, right? How are these trees buried under 1,000 feet of hard frozen ground? We're faced with the same series of questions we first saw with the frozen mammoths. Again, it seems there was a sudden and dramatic freezing accompanied by rapid burial in muck, now frozen solid. And we find this evidence all over the world. That's all around the Arctic Circle. But they have this other thing in Siberia in particular called a yadoma, right? It says in Siberia, frozen mammoths are frequently found in strange hills 30 to 260 feet high, which Russian geologists call yadomas. For example, a mammoth cemetery containing remains of 156 mammoths was in a yadoma. 156 dead elephants, frozen solid in this yadoma. It's known that these hills were formed under cold, windy conditions because they are composed of a powdery, homogeneous soil honeycombed with thick veins of ice. Sometimes the ice, which several Russian geologists have concluded was formed simultaneously with the soil, accounts for 90% of the yadoma's volume. So you got all this frozen water mixed in with this dirt, but in some areas it's 90% water. Some yadomas contain many broken trees in the wildest disorder, they say. The natives, and this is kind of interesting, we'll get to this a little later in another lesson on Noah's Ark, but a lot of times this history is passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation to generation, and science wants to discount it, because I can't prove all that stuff. It's folklore. Maybe it's not folklore. But the natives call these places wood hills because there's so much trees buried in it and stuff. And the buried trees they call Noah's wood, right? Because it happened during Noah's flood. Yadoma soil is similar to muck. It contains tiny plant remains. It's high in salt and carbonate, which we learned earlier is required for fossilization, and has more than 2.5 times the carbon that is in the world's tropical forests. The Berezovka mammoth was found in similar soil. So when that mammoth was found, it had started to melt a little bit, and the face of this yadoma had melted away, and his face and trunk were kind of sticking out, right? And the predators had eaten a lot of the trunk and his face off, right? But as the story goes, the guys who found it carved some of the meat off and cooked it and ate it themselves, right? So, pretty fresh. It's kind of an interesting one as well. It says there are some cases of finds of not only dead mammals, but also fishes, unfortunately lost to science. In 1942, during road construction in northeastern Russia, an explosion opened a subterranean lens of transparent ice encasing frozen specimen of some big fishes. Apparently, the explosion opened an ancient river channel with an ancient fish frozen alive in the water column. The superintendent of construction reported the fishes to be of amazing freshness, and the chunks of meat thrown out by the explosion were eaten by those present. Okay? So you see the picture there. You got this ancient river that got frozen, flash frozen from top to bottom, and this earth was deposited on top of it, right? And it remained frozen to this day, 4,500 years later. Perhaps more amazing, so there's a second report comes from a missionary traveler in Tibet in 1846. After many of the missionaries' party had frozen to death, survivors pitched their tents on the banks of this river, which I can't pronounce. It says that at the moment of crossing the river, a singular spectacle presented itself. This is his quote from his writings. He says, while yet in our encampment, we had observed at a distance some black, shapeless objects ranged in file across the great river. No change either in form or distinctness was apparent as we advanced, nor was it till we were quite close that we recognized in them a troop of the wild oxen. There were more than 50 of them, encrusted in the ice. No doubt they had tried to swim across in the moment of freezing and had been unable to disengage themselves. Their beautiful heads, surmounted with huge horns, were still above the surface, but their bodies were held fast in the ice, which was so transparent that the position of the imprudent beast was easily distinguishable. They looked as if still swimming, but the eagles and ravens had pecked out their eyes. Okay, so here we got 50 cattle, right? They were instantly frozen in a flowing river. How does that work? We all know that bodies of water don't freeze that way, right? So any explanation for these strange discoveries must recognize that streams freeze from the top down. The ice formed floats and then insulates the water, the warmer liquid water below. The thicker the ice grows, the harder it is for the liquid's heat to pass up through the ice layer into the cold air. Freezing a stream fast enough to trap more than 50 upright oxen in the act of swimming or fish in mid-water column seems impossible, especially because the stream's velocity varies across its width. Therefore, different parts of the stream should freeze over many days or hours. Freezing a river so fast that large fish are frozen, edible, and underground defies belief. However, the similarities with the frozen mammoths are so great that these reports seem to be related. Now, the way he explains this is when this huge hail fell from the sky, it was mixed with mud, a lot of it, and dirt, and so on and so forth. But like I say, under normal conditions, if it just gets cold outside, and you have a lake out here, you get a skim of ice on the top, and if it stays cold for long enough, it'll freeze all the way to the bottom. But it's a slow process. It takes hours, days, sometimes weeks, depending on the temperature. In this case, the entire water column froze almost instantly. He said the way that happened was this ice, minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hits the water, and because it's got mud in it, it goes all the way to the bottom. Okay? And it flash freezes the entire water column, and anything is in it, right? So, to me, I don't know of another way to freeze a fish while he's still swimming. That would be hard. Or an ox who's struggling to get out of the water. He's frozen so quickly, he doesn't look like he's struggling. He looks like he's still swimming, right? It's pretty quick to freeze an animal that size that quickly. So with that, that's frozen animals associated with the Great Flood. Let's close with prayer. Lord Jesus, once again, we do thank you that you've given us an opportunity to study your word, Lord, and pray that you would hide these things deep in our heart, that, Lord, that we might come away knowing that your word is true, and we can count on it in all cases. We'd ask once again, as you bless the bread of life as it's broken to us from the pulpit, that we become better equipped to serve. For we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.